She was a penniless widow with exactly 1 meal left to her name. When she found 3 starving, shivering children huddled in the winter snow, she didn't hesitate to give them her very last bite. But she had no idea who she was really inviting into her quiet home. She didn't know those ragged orphans belonged to the most feared man in the realm, and she certainly didn't know the ruthless Alpha King was standing right outside in the dark, watching her every move. The wind carried the first bite of winter through the village of Yieldwood, and Margaret pulled her old shawl tighter as she stepped out to fetch the last of the firewood. She had been a widow for nearly 2 years now, and the evenings were the hardest part. Not the work, though there was plenty of that. It was the quiet that followed the work. The empty chair by the hearth. The second bowl she still set out without thinking, then had to put away again. She was bending to gather the kindling when she heard it. A sound so small and so lost that at first she thought it was a bird caught in the brambles. A whimper, thin as thread, swallowed almost at once by the wind. Margaret straightened and listened. The sound came again, closer this time, from the direction of the old oak that marked the edge of her yard. She walked toward it slowly, her boots leaving deep prints in the frost-tinged grass, and then she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. There, huddled at the base of the oak, were 3 children. The oldest was a boy of perhaps 12, with a sharp, watchful face that looked far older than his years. He was braced in front of the other 2 as if he meant to shield them with his own thin body, his jaw set tight even as his shoulders trembled from cold. Behind him, a girl of about 8 pressed herself against the trunk, her face streaked with tears and dirt. And in the girl's lap, curled into a small, shivering bundle, slept a toddler who could not have been more than 3. They were dressed in rags. Not the clean rags of a hard-working poor family, but the torn, filthy scraps of children who had been on the road for a long time. Their shoes were held together with bits of string. Their cheeks were hollow, their eyes too large for their faces. Margaret's hands think, for tea to her apron, smoothing it in the nervous habit she could never quite shake. She had nothing. A small pot of soup, half a loaf of bread that had gone a little hard, a pat of butter the size of her thumb. It was her supper, and it was all she had for the next 3 days until the miller paid her for the week's sewing. The boy's eyes met hers, and there was no pleading in them, only wariness and a fierce, defiant pride that cut her to the bone. He knows what it is to be turned away, she thought. He has been turned away before. Mama, the toddler murmured in his sleep, and Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. She did not think. She did not weigh the cost of her own empty belly against the sight of those 3 ragged children, because there was nothing to weigh. There was only the cold and the hunger and the terrible smallness of them under the big winter sky. "Come inside," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "The fire is still lit. You'll freeze out here." The boy did not move. His eyes narrowed, searching her face for the lie, for the trap, for the cruelty he had clearly learned to expect from the world. "I'm not asking for charity," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "We'll be on our way before dawn. Just let the little ones warm up a bit, that's all." Margaret nodded slowly. She knew better than to argue with pride that had been worn thin as an old blanket. "Fair enough," she said. "You can warm up by the fire, and we'll see how things look come morning. I've got some soup if you're hungry." The girl peeked out from behind the boy, her eyes enormous in her pale face. "Soup," she whispered, and the word came out like a prayer. Something in Margaret's chest ached. She thought of the empty chair by her heart. The second bowl. She still set out by mistake. The long, silent evenings with no one to talk to but the walls. "Come on, then," she said, and she held out her hand. The boy did not take it. But he did not stop her when she bent down and lifted the toddler into her arms. The child stirred, blinked up at her with drowsy, unfocused eyes, then burrowed his face into her shoulder with a trust that made her throat tighten. "He smells of wood smoke and road dust and something sweet underneath," she thought. "He smells like a child who has not been held enough." She carried him inside, and the other 2 followed, treading softly as if they were afraid the floorboards might bite. The cottage was small and spare, but the fire was warm, and the light of it made the shadows dance across the walls. Margaret set the toddler down on the old sheepskin rug by the hearth, then ladled out the soup into her 2 bowls and a cracked earthenware mug. It was thin soup, mostly water and a few vegetables and a bit of barley, but it was hot, and it was honest food. The children ate as if they had not eaten in days. Perhaps they had not. Margaret watched them, her own supper forgotten, and felt the familiar ache of a heart that had known loss and recognized it in others. "You can stay the night," she said quietly, when the bowls were scraped clean. "It's too cold to be out there. There's a spare pallet in the corner. I'll make it up for the little one." The boy looked at her, and for a moment that fierce wariness flickered, revealing something younger and more frightened underneath. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do that? You don't know us." Margaret smiled, a small, tired smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I had a husband once," she said. "He was taken by a lord's levy and sent to fight a general war that had nothing to do with him. He never came home. I know what it is to have no one, and to need someone to be kind to you for no reason at all." The boy stared at her, his lips parted, then closed again. He did not speak, but something in his posture softened, just a little. Margaret turned away to find an old quilt for the pallet, and as she did, she happened to glance out the window. The moon was rising over the eastern ridge, silver and cold, and there, at the top of the hill, outlined against the pale sky, stood a tall figure on horseback. A man wrapped in a dark, heavy cloak, his face hidden by the shadow of his hood. He was not moving. He was simply sitting there, watching the cottage, watching the light in the window. Margaret's breath caught. Her hand went to her chest, where her heart was beating hard and fast. She had lived on the northern border long enough to know that strangers did not come to Eildwood at night, and they did not stand on the hill and watch a poor widow's cottage without there being a reason. The toddler stirred on the rug behind her, mumbling something soft and formless, and Margaret forced herself to turn away from the window. The figure was too far away to see clearly, too still to be a threat in any ordinary sense, and yet she could not shake the feeling that those hidden eyes were fixed on her, on the children, on the warm spill of light from her door. "Who is it?" the boy asked, his voice low and sharp. He had come to stand beside her, his thin shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on the same distant figure. "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "Go back to the fire. You'll catch your death in that draught." He did not move. For a long moment they stood together in silence, watching the horseman on the hill. Then, as if he hectares thank what he came to see, the figure turned his horse's head and rode slowly down the far side of the ridge, disappearing into the dark line of the forest. The boy let out a breath he had been holding. "He was watching us," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "He was." She closed the wooden shutter and latched it, though the gesture felt flimsy, a child's game against a cold that could not be shut out. The fire crackled. The toddler slept on. The 2 older children hovered near the hearth, their eyes dark with exhaustion and something else she could not name. Margaret did not sleep well that night. She lay on her narrow bed, listening to the wind and the soft breathing of her 3 unexpected guests, and she thought about the figure on the hill. She thought about the way he had sat so still, so patient, as if he had all the time in the world to watch and wait. She thought about him, and she thought about the children, and she thought about the strange, uneasy feeling that her quiet life had just been cracked open, like an egg, and that something new and unknowable was pressing in from the dark. In the morning the children were still there. Margaret woke to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of the boy, Thomas. He had told her his name before he fell asleep, tending the fire with the careful competence of someone who had done it many times before. The girl, Eleanor, was sitting by the pallet, watching the toddler sleep, and the toddler himself was sitting up, blinking at the room with round, cureless eyes. "Mama," he said, reaching for Margaret with both chubby arms. Her heart turned over. She did not correct him. She simply lifted him up and held him, his small, warm weight a comfort she had not known she was longing for. "There's a pot of oats," she said, her voice a little rough. "We'll eat, and then we'll figure out what to do with the day." Thomas looked at her, and for the first time the wariness in his eyes softened into something like cautious hope. You're not going to send us away?" Margaret set the toddler on her hip and met the boy's gaze. "Not today," she said. "Maybe not tomorrow either. We'll see." And she did not tell them about the figure on the hill, the horseman in the dark cloak who had watched them through the window. She did not tell them because she did not want to frighten them, and because she did not know what it meant. But she could not stop thinking about him, and as the morning light crept across the floor, warming the cold stones, Margaret had the uneasy feeling that the man on the hill was not done with them yet, that he had been watching for a reason, and that reason was not finished with her cottage or with the 3 ragged children sleeping by her fire. The morning came slow and gray, the way it always did this time of year, and Margaret woke to the sound of a child coughing in her own bed. For a moment she did not remember. Then the weight of a small body shifted beside her, and she turned to see Eleanor curled against her side, one thin hand clutching the edge of Margaret's shawl. The girl's cheeks were flushed with sleep, her lips slightly parted, and in the gray light she looked even younger than her 8 years. Margaret lay still, afraid to move and wake her. She could hear Thomas moving about in the main room, the soft scrape of his boots on the stone floor, the crackle of the fire he had already coaxed back to life. The boy was quiet, but he was not idle. He had been that way since the moment she opened her door to them, alert, watchful, as if he expected the kindness to be snatched away at any second. She eased herself out of bed, careful not to disturb Eleanor, and padded into the main room in her bare feet. The cottage was small, 1 room for living, 1 for sleeping, a lean-to for the goat, but it had been hers for 11 years, and she knew every draught, every creak, every place where the thatch leaked when it rained. Thomas was crouched by the fire, feeding it small sticks from a bundle he must have gathered himself. He looked up when she entered, his face guarded. "I found dry wood by the door," he said, nodding toward the pile. "There was sitting near deer last night." Margaret frowned. She had split the last of her logs 2 days ago, and she had not had time to gather more. "What do you mean by the door?" "Just there, a whole bundle, tied with twine, and a sack of flour beside it." She crossed to the door and opened it. The morning air bit at her cheeks, sharp with the smell of frost and fallen leaves. And there, propped against the wall where the shadow lay deepest, was exactly what the boy had described. A neat bundle of split wood, the ends pale and fresh, and beside it a small sack of flour, the cloth damp with dew. Margaret stared at them for a long moment. Her first thought was one of the neighbors, old widow Nan perhaps, who sometimes left things when she thought Margaret was not looking. But Nan was too frail to carry a bundle of wood that size, and she would have knocked, would have called out through the door. No, this had been left in silence, in the dark, by someone who did not want to be seen. The memory of the horseman on the hill came back to her, the dark cloak, the still figure watching her cottage through the window as the children slept by her fire. She had told herself it was a traveler, a merchant passing through, someone who had stopped to rest his horse before moving on. But now, staring at the anonymous gift on her doorstep, she was not so sure. She knelt and touched the wood. It was dry, well-seasoned, cut with care, the kind of wood a man would bring if he knew how to read the weather, if he knew the cold was coming and wanted someone else to be warm. "Who left it?" Thomas asked from behind her. Margaret stood, brushing her hands on her apron. "I don't know," she said, and that was the truth, though it sat uneasily in her chest. She fed the children breakfast, porridge made from the new flour, thinned with water and sweetened with a scrape of honey she had been saving. William woke cranky and clung to her skirts, his small face buried in the wool while she stirred the pot. Eleanor ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if she were afraid it might disappear. Thomas ate fastest, but Margaret noticed he kept an eye on his siblings, making sure they had enough before he took his own second helping. When the bowls were empty and the fire was banked, she told them she needed to go to the well, and that they were to stay inside out of sight. "It's not that you're in trouble," she added, seeing the flicker of alarm in Thomas's eyes. "It's just, there are people in this village who talk, and I'd rather they talk about something else for now." Thomas nodded, a too old understanding in his face. "We know how to keep quiet." She believed him. The well was at the far end of the lane where the cottages dinned out and the path began to climb toward the forest. Margaret walked with the bucket in her hand, her shawl pulled tight against the wind, her mind turning over the mystery of the wood and the flower. She was so lost in thought that she nearly walked straight past him. He was standing at the edge of the lane beside his horse, a tall black beast with a white blaze on its forehead, its breath steaming in the cold air. The man himself was wrapped in a dark traveling cloak, the hood thrown back to reveal a head of deep gold hair, cut short, and a face that had seen weather and war and very little kindness. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of morning mist, but the hard gray of winter iron. And there was a scar through his left eyebrow, pale and old, that pulled the corner of his mouth into something that might have been a frown or might have been a smile. Margaret stopped. The bucket slipped in her grip, and she caught it before it fell. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of wood smoke and horse and cold earth. The man's horse stamped a hoof, impatient, but he did not move. "You're the woman who took them in," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, as if it had been a long time since he had used it for anything but giving orders. "The children. You fed them, gave them shelter." Margaret's heart was hammering against her ribs, but she made herself stand still. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He did not answer, at least once. He looked at her, really looked, the way a man looks at a map before he decides which road to take. Then he said, "My name is Alexander. And those children—" He paused, and something flickered in his gray eyes, something that looked almost like pain. "They are mine." The words hung in the air between them, heavy as frost. Margaret felt the ground shift under her feet, felt the world tilt and settle into a shape she had not expected. "Yours?" she repeated. "You mean you're their father?" He did not confirm it. He did not deny it either. He simply stood there, his jaw tight, his hands still at his sides, and let the silence answer for him. Margaret thought of the 3 children sleeping by her fire, the girl who clung to her shawl, the boy who gathered wood before she asked, the toddler who reached for her with such trust. She thought of the horseman on the hill, watching through the window, and suddenly it all made a terrible kind of sense. "Why didn't you come to the door?" she asked. "Why leave them out there in the cold, if they're yours?" The question landed harder than she intended. She saw it hit him, saw the way his mouth tightened, the way his eyes flickered away from hers and fixed on some point in the middle distance. "I didn't know if you'd let me near them," he said finally, "and I didn't know if they'd want to see me. You're their father, they'd want to see you." He said nothing. And in that silence, Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of him. This was not the cold, merciless alpha king of the stories, the man who could order a village burned and not lose sleep. This was a man standing at the edge of a lane, afraid to knock on a door. She took a breath. "They're inside," she said. "They're safe. They had porridge this morning, and they're warm." "Thank you." The words came out stiff, unfamiliar, as if he were speaking a language he had learned but never used. "The wood, the flower, it was me. I thought it might be." He nodded, and for a moment the mask of his face seemed to crack. "I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know how to ask." Margaret looked at him, this tall, scarred man with the winter gray eyes, standing in the middle of her village lane with his horse and his cloak and his terrible, clumsy honesty. She had spent 11 years nursing her hatred of lords and kings, of men who took and never gave. And now, here was the greatest of them all, standing in front of her, unable to say the simplest thing. "Ask what?" she said. He met her eyes then, and for a moment he looked almost young. "Ask if I could see them. Just see them. See that they're all right." The wind pulled at Margaret's shawl and she pulled it tighter. The bucket hung heavy in her hand, and the water in the bottom had gone cold. She should tell him to leave. She should tell him she wanted nothing to do with him or his children or his troubles. But she could still feel the weight of the toddler in her arms, the small hand clutching her shawl. She could still see the way Thomas had looked at her with that too-old suspicion, and the way it had softened, just a little, when she said he could stay. "They're at my cottage," she said, "at the end of the lane. The one with the rosemary on the windowsill." He looked at her, and something passed between them. Gratitude, maybe, or surprise, or the beginning of something neither of them had a name for yet. "I'll come tomorrow," he said, "if that's all right." Margaret nodded, though she was not sure it was all right at all. And then, before she could change her mind, she turned and walked back toward the well, filling her bucket and carrying it home without looking back. But she felt his eyes on her the whole way, and when she reached her door and glanced over her shoulder, he was still standing there, a dark figure against the gray morning, watching he cacked with a look she could not quite read. She went inside and closed the door. The children were where she left them, clustered around the fire, safe and warm. William looked up and reached for her, and she lifted him onto her hip, pressing her cheek to his soft hair. "Who was that?" Thomas asked quietly. Margaret hesitated. Then she said, "No one, just a traveler." But she knew it was not true. And as the morning crept toward noon, she found herself looking out the window again and again, half expecting to see the tall man still standing there in the lane, watching the cottage with those winter-gray eyes. He had said he would come tomorrow, and Margaret, who had spent 11 years trusting no one, found herself almost believing him. The morning came in gray and cold, with a frost that clung to the window glass like lace. Margaret woke before the light, as she always did, and for a moment she lay still, listening to the soft breathing of the 3 small bodies clustered on the pallet by the fire. She had not slept well. Her dreams had been full of gray eyes and a tall figure standing in the lane, watching her cottage. She had woken twice, certain she heard footsteps. But when she looked out, there was nothing but the empty road and the pale moon. Now she rose quietly, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and set the kettle over the fire. The children would be hungry when they woke, and there was little enough to give them. She had used the flour Alexander left, mixing it with water and a pinch of salt to make a thin porridge. It was not much, but it was warm, and warmth mattered more than anything in a cold October cottage. She was stirring the pot when she heard a small sound behind her. She turned. Eleanor was standing in the middle of the room, clutching the elastic ekin of her threadbare blanket, her dark hair a tangled nest around her thin face. "Did you sleep well, love?" Margaret asked softly. Eleanor nodded, then shook her head. "I dreamed of the cold," she whispered. "The cold in the woods. It was so dark, Margaret. I thought we would never be warm again." Margaret knelt down and opened her arms. Eleanor came to her without hesitation, burying her face in the worn wool of Margaret's dress. Margaret held her, one hand stroking the child's tangled hair, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The cold in the woods was real, and she could not undo it. But she could hold this child now, warm and safe, and that was something. Thomas woke a little while later, and William too. The boy who had been so wary the day before sat up and looked around the cottage with the same careful, measuring gaze Margaret had seen in grown men who had lived too long in fear. He did not run to her, he simply watched, his arms wrapped around his knees, his jaw set. "Your father is coming today," Margaret said quietly, setting bowls of porridge on the low table. "He said he would come." Thomas's face did not change. "He says a lot of things." Margaret studied him for a moment, then said nothing. She had learned long ago that some wounds could not be pushed open with questions. They opened on their own when the time was right. The morning passed quietly. Margaret told the children, then set about the day's work. But as she moved through the cottage, she kept noticing the small, sorry state of their clothes. Eleanor's dress was torn at the shoulder, the seam gaping open to show the pale skin beneath. Thomas's shirt was missing 2 buttons, the cuffs frayed almost to nothing. Even William, who had been given the warmest of the blankets, had a coat so thin it was little more than a rag. Margaret looked at them, then looked at the bundle of cloth scraps she kept in the corner, meant for patching her own worn things. She hesitated. Her own dresses were nearly as threadbare as the children's, but she had a needle and thread and a pair of hands that had never been idle a day in her life. She made a decision. "After you've eaten," she said, "I'm going to mend those clothes. Eleanor, come here, let me see that shoulder." Eleanor came, and Margaret knelt beside her, examining the torn seam with a practiced eye. "This won't take long," she murmured. "Sit still now." She fetched her needle and thread and set to work. The cottage fell into a quiet rhythm, the crackle of the fire, the soft scrape of the needle, the occasional murmur of Margaret's voice as she soothed William, who had crawled into her lap and was now playing with the loose end of her apron string. Thomas sat by the hearth, whittling a stick with a small knife he must have carried from somewhere. his eyes flicking occasionally toward Margaret, but never quite meeting hers. "Sit still," Margaret said gently as Eleanor squirmed. "I'm almost done." "You do this a lot?" Eleanor asked. "Mend things?" "Every day, child. Mending is what keeps a household together. You patch the small holes before they become big ones, and you take care of the things you love." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very softly, "No one ever mended my clothes before." Margaret's needle paused. She did not look up, but her voice was gentle. "Well, someone does now. And if you're good and stay still, I'll teach you to do it yourself. A woman should know how to mend what matters." By midday, Margaret had mended Eleanor's dress, patched Thomas's shirt, and reinforced William's little coat with a double layer of the warmest wool she had. She had also fed them all again, a thin but hot soup made from the last of her vegetables and a bone she had been saving for a special occasion. The children ate as if they had not seen food in a week, which, Margaret suspected, was close to the truth. She did not think about the tall man who had stood in the lane. She did not think about his gray eyes or the way he had said, "The children are mine," with something that sounded almost like pain. She told herself it did not matter who he was. What mattered was that these children were warm and fed and safe, at least for today. But outside, in the shadow of the oak tree that stood at the edge of Margaret's garden, a tall figure in a dark cloak stood perfectly still, watching through the small, smoke-darkened window. Alexander had come early, as he always did. He had come before dawn, in fact, and had stood in the cold for nearly 2 hours trying to summon the courage to knock on a door. He who had led armies, who had faced down rebellious lords and wild northern raiders, who had been called the coldest man in the kingdom, could not bring himself to lift his hand and knock on the door of a poor widow's cottage. So he had stood in the shadow of the oak, and he had watched. He had watched her wake, he had watched her kneel by the fire, stirring the pot, he had watched her hold the little girl who had come to her for comfort, and he had felt something twist in his chest, something he had not felt in more years than he cared to count. And then he had watched her mend. He saw the way her hands moved, quick and sure, the needle flashing in and out of the worn cloth. He saw the way she murmured to the children, her voice too low for him to hear, but the tone unmistakable, patient, warm, full of a tenderness he had never known. He saw the way she gave them her own food, her own cloth, her own warmth, asking nothing in return. No one had ever done that for him. His father had given him orders, his tutors had given him lessons, his soldiers had given him obedience. But no one had ever looked at him the way this woman looked at those children, as if he mattered not for what he could do, but simply because he was there. Alexander's throat tightened. He stood there for a long time, watching the little cottage and the woman inside it, and he felt something crack, something deep and old, something he had built walls around for 40 years, something he had been told 100 times was weakness. He felt it crack, and he did not know what to do with the feeling. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, but he did not go far. He went to the edge of the village, where the road bent toward the forest, and he sat on a fallen log, staring at nothing. He had come to see his children. He had come to check on them, to make sure they were safe, to do his duty as a father, but he had not been able to walk through that door. He had been too afraid. What would she think of him? A man who could not even knock on a door, who could not look his own children in the eye, who had to leave anonymous bundles of firewood and flour because he did not know how to give anything else. He sat there for a long time. The cold seeped through his cloak, but he did not move. He thought about his sister, dead these 3 years, who had trusted him with her children before she went. He thought about the promises he had made her, promises he had broken 100 times because he did not know how to be a father. He thought about the children, alone in the world. Think it from him. And how he had brought them to the edge of a village and left them there in the cold, too afraid to face them. And he thought about the woman with the gentle hands and the warm eyes, who had taken in 3 strangers without a word, and who had mended their clothes with thread and patience and something that looked like love. He had never seen anything like it. He had never known anyone like her, and he wanted, more than he had ever wanted anything, for her to look at him the way she looked at those children, just once, even for a moment. It was a foolish thought. He knew it was foolish. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, a man who had built his life on strength and distance. He had no right to want such things. He had no right to hope for them. but he wanted them anyway. When the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Alexander rose and walked back toward the village. He did not go to the cottage. He went instead to a small stone bridge that crossed the stream at the edge of the village, and he waited. He waited until he saw Margaret come out of her cottage, a basket over her arm, heading toward the well. He watched her draw water, watched her straighten and wipe her brow, watched her turn back toward the cottage, and then, before she could see him, he slipped away, leaving behind a small leather pouch on the doorstep of her cottage. A pouch filled with silver coins, enough to feed the children for a month. Beside it he placed a folded piece of parchment, weighted with a stone. He did not knock. He did not call out. He simply left the pouch and the note, and he walked away into the gathering dusk, his heart pounding in a way it had not done in years. Back inside the cottage, Margaret was just settling the children down for the evening meal. He heard a sound at the door. She tensed, her hand going to the iron poker by the hearth. Then she heard it again, a soft scrape, as if something had been set down. She opened the door cautiously. There was no one there. But on the doorstep, she found a small leather pouch and a folded scrap of parchment. She picked them up, her fingers trembling slightly. She unfolded the parchment. The writing was clumsy, the letters uneven, as if the writer had not practiced much. "It is not payment," the note read. "It is thanks. They are safe because of you. I do not know how to say what I feel. I never learned. But they are safe, and it is because of you. I will come tomorrow, if you let me." There was no signature, but Margaret knew who had written it. She stood there in the cold, holding the note and the pouch, and she felt something shift in her chest. Something she had not felt in 11 years. She looked down at the silver coins. There were enough to feed them all for a long time, enough to buy new cloth, new shoes, new everything the children needed. And she thought of the tall man in the lane, with his gray eyes and his clumsy hands, and his terrible, beautiful inability to say what he meant. He had stood at her door and he had not knocked. He had left a pouch of silver and a note that said, "I never learned how to say what I feel." And Margaret, who had spent 11 years trusting no one, found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this man than the cold and the distance and the legend. She closed the door and leaned against it, the pouch clutched to her chest. "Mama?" William's small voice came from the fire. "Mama, come." She went to him. She lifted him into her arms and held him close, and she felt the silver coins press against her heart. Tomorrow, he would come. And Margaret, for the first time in 11 years, was not sure she wanted him to go away again. The children ate their breakfast as if it were a feast, and Margaret stood at the window, watching the lane that led to the village. The morning light was thin and pale, the kind of light that came just before the frost settled in for the day. He said he would come today. She had told herself she did not care either way. She had told herself that a man like that, a lord, a king, a legend, did not keep promises made to a village widow. But she had also told herself, as she stirred the porridge, that she had never met a man who looked quite so lost as he had standing in her doorway yesterday. Thomas came to stand beside her. He was 12, but he had the eyes of a man who had seen too much. He watched her for a long moment, then said, "You keep looking at the lane." "I'm looking at the weather," she said. "You're looking for him." Margaret turned from the window. "Eat your porridge." Thomas did not argue. But I saw the way his mouth tightened, the way he held his spoon a moment too long. He was learning to trust her, that boy. And trust, Margaret knew, was a fragile thing. She was scrubbing the pot when old Widow Nan appeared at her door, wrapped in a shawl that smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. Nan was 70 if she was a day, with a face like a withered apple and eyes that missed nothing. "I heard you've taken in strays," Nan said, settling herself onto the stool by the fire without waiting to be asked. "They're not strays," Margaret said. "They're children. Children. Strays. Same thing when they've got no roof of their own." Nan peered at the 3 of them, Thomas by the fire, Eleanor tracing patterns in the dust on the floor, William asleep in the corner.
"And you're feeding them from your own pot, on your own wood, in your own house? You always did have more heart than sense." Margaret said nothing. She had learned that Nan was like a river, best to let her talk until she ran dry. "Word's spreading, you know," Nan went on, "about the tall man in the dark cloak who's been seen around the village, about how he stood at your door like a lost calf and didn't so much as knock. He left a note," Margaret said, and immediately wished she hadn't. Nan's eyes sharpened. "A note? From a man who doesn't so much as knock?" She leaned forward. "And what did the note say?" Margaret turned back to the pot. "It said nothing worth repeating." "Nothing worth repeating?" Nan made a sound that was half laugh, half snort. "In my 70 years, I've learned that a man who writes notes instead of speaking is either a coward or a man who feels too much to trust his own voice." Margaret scrubbed at the pot with more force than necessary. She did not want to think about the note, about the words that had pressed against her heart like warm stones. "I never learned how to say what I feel." "Did you know them?" Nan asked, her voice softer now. "The children, before they came to you?" "No." "Then why—" Nan stopped, and for the first time in all the years Margaret had known her, she looked uncertain. "Why did you take them in?" Margaret set down the pot. She dried her hands on her apron, slowly, carefully, the way she did when she was trying to keep her voice steady. "Because they were hungry," she said. "Because it was cold. Because someone had to—" Nan was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in a voice that was not quite like her own, "You know who he is, don't you? The man in the dark cloak. I know he's someone important. Someone important."
"Thing?" Nan shook her head. "Margaret, that man is Alexander of House Thornwood, the Alpha King of the Northern Lands. The one they say is colder than the winter wind." The pot slipped from Margaret's hands and clattered into the basin. She caught it, but her fingers were trembling. "Thornwood," she repeated. "The Alpha King." "The same," Nan said. "And I'll tell you something else, though I shouldn't. I heard it from Imler's wife, who heard it from the blacksmith's daughter, who was at the castle gate when the riders came through last spring." She lowered her voice. "Those children, the ones you've taken in, they're not just strays. They're his sister's children, orphaned when she died. He's been raising them alone, and no one in the court thinks he's fit for it. A king who never learned to love, raising 3 children who never learned to be loved." Margaret stood very still. The water in the basin rippled around her hands, and she watched it settle, the way she had watched so many things settle in her life. Hopes, fears, the small, quiet dreams she had learned not to speak aloud. His sister's children, not his own. He had stood at her door and said, "Those 3 children are mine," and she had understood him to mean they were his by blood. But they were his by grief instead, his sister's children, left to a man who had never learned to love. She thought of the way he had looked at William in the firelight, the way his hands had hung at his sides, unused to gentleness, the way he had written that note in the dark, because he could not say the words aloud. "Nan," Margaret said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "Why did no one tell me this before?" Nan shrugged. "No one thought you needed to know. You're just a widow in a cottage at the edge of the wood. Why call the Alpha King's troubles matter to you?" Margaret turned from the basin. Her hands were dry now, and her heart was beating hard and fast, the way it did when she was about to do something she knew she would not be able to take back. "Because I have his children in my house," she said. "And I think he should have told me himself." She found him at the village well, as if the day had been waiting for her to look for him there. He was standing with his back to her, his dark cloak pulled tight against the wind, and he was holding something in his hands. A small wooden whistle, half-carved, the kind a man might make for a child who had never had one. He did not turn when she approached, but I saw the way his shoulders tightened, the way his grip on the whistle shifted. "You're Alexander of House Thornwood," she said. "The Alpha King." He turned. His gray eyes met hers, and there was something in them that she had not seen before. Not coldness, not distance, but the wary watchfulness of a man who had been caught. "Yes," he said. "And the children?" Her voice caught, and she steadied it. "They're your sister's children, orphaned. You've been raising them alone."
He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You heard." "I heard from old widow Nan, who heard from the miller's wife, who heard from the blacksmith's daughter." Margaret took a step closer. "I had to hear it from the village gossip, Alexander. I had to learn from strangers that the children I've been feeding from my own pot are the nieces and nephews of the Alpha King, and that he has been standing in my doorway, leaving silver and notes, while telling me nothing." He looked at her, and for a moment, he was not the Alpha King. He was just a man, standing at a well with a half-carved whistle in his hands, looking at him like he had been caught in a lie he had not meant to tell. "I did not know how to say it," he said. "You knew how to write it," Margaret said. "You wrote that you never learned how to say what you feel, but you never wrote the truth." "The truth," he repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. "The truth is that I am the Alpha King of the Northern Lands, and I have 3 children who are not mine by blood but by grief. The truth is that I have never known how to be a father to them, and I am afraid every day that I will fail them the way my own father failed me." He stopped. "The truth is that when I saw you feeding them from your own supper, I did not know what to do with what I felt." Margaret stood very still. The wind pulled at her headscarf and she let it. "You could have told me," she said, more gently now. "You could have knocked on my door and said, 'Those are my sister's children, and I don't know how to care for them, and I need help.'" "I have never asked for help," he said. "Then it's time you learned." He looked at her, and something shifted in his gray eyes. Not much, just a little, like the first crack in a frozen river. He held out the wooden whistle. "I was going to give this to Thomas," he said. "I made it last night. I don't know if he'll want it. I don't know how to give things to children without making them feel like they owe me something." Margaret looked at the whistle. It was rough, unpolished, the work of a man who had never carved anything before, but the shape was good, and the hole was true, and she could see the care in it, the way he had pressed his thumb into the wood to make the mouthpiece smooth. "He'll want it," she said, "but you have to give it to him yourself, not leave it on the doorstep like silver and notes." Alexander owned. "I don't know how to give things to children." "You give them the thing," Margaret said, "and then you stay. You don't walk away, you stay and watch them hold it. And you don't expect anything in return." He looked at the whistle in his hands, then at her. "Is that what you did? When you fed them?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I fed them because they were hungry. I didn't expect anything in return." "Then you understand," he said, "why I left the silver, and why I wrote the note. Because I didn't know how to give you something and stay." The wind picked up, pulling at the edges of his cloak. Margaret watched him, this tall man with the gray eyes and the clumsy hands and the half-carved whistle, and she felt something in her chest loosen, just a little. "Come back to the cottage," she said. "The children are finishing their porridge. You can give Thomas the whistle, and you can stay and watch him hold it, and then you can leave, if you want." Alexander looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and careful, like a man learning a new language. "I would like that," he said. They walked back to the cottage together, the Alpha King and the village widow, and the wind was cold, but the day was bright. Thomas took the whistle with both hands, turning it over and over like something precious. He did not smile, but I saw the way his fingers closed around it, the way he held it against his chest. "It's a good whistle," he said. Alexander stood very still, watching him. "I made it myself." Thomas looked up at him, and for a moment the boy and the king were just 2 people, learning how to give and receive. Then Thomas put the whistle to his lips and blew, and the sound was clear and true, a small, bright note in the cold air. Eleanor laughed. Liam clapped his hands, and Margaret, standing in the doorway, felt something warm settle in her chest. Alexander turned to her, and there was something in his gray eyes that she had not seen before, not coldness, not distance, but a kind of quiet wonder. "Thank you," he said. "You said that already," Margaret said. "I said it for the food," Alexander said. "This is for the lesson." He left at dusk, as the light turned gold and the shadows grew long. He stood at the door, and he did not knock, but he did not leave a pouch of silver either. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will come again, and I will try to give without walking away." Margaret did not answer. She stood in the doorway, watching him go, and she felt the way she had felt when she had watched him walk away the first time, except now the feeling was not uncertainty. It was something else, something she had not felt in 11 years. Thomas came to stand beside her. He held the whistle in his hand, and he looked up at her with those old eyes. "He'll come back," Thomas said. "How do you know?" Thomas turned the whistle over in his hands. "Because he made me this. A man who makes something with his own hands for a child he doesn't know how to love. He's not going to walk away." Margaret looked at the lane where Alexander had disappeared into the dusk. She thought of the note he had written, the silver he had left, the way he had stood at her door without knocking. "Maybe," she said softly, "maybe he won't." And she closed the door, and the children gathered around the fire, and the whistle made its small, bright sound in the gathering dark. The day Alexander did not come, Margaret told herself it did not matter. She had woken early, as she always did, and she had set the porridge on the fire, and she had told herself
that a man like that, a king, no matter how he tried to hide it, would not keep a promise made in the dusk to a village widow. She had told herself that, and she had believed it, and she had gone about her morning with her jaw set tight. But the children felt it too. Thomas kept looking at the lane. Eleanor asked, 3 times, "When is the tall man coming?" And William, who had finally learned to say a new word, toddled to the door and said, "Dada," in his small, hopeful voice. Margaret's heart cracked a little at that, but she did not let it show. "Eat your porridge," she said firmly. "He's a busy man. Kings have kingdoms to mind." "He said he'd come," Thomas said quietly, not accusing, just stating it, the way he stated things, with those old eyes. Margaret did not answer. She wiped the table with her apron, even though it was already clean. By midday, the sky had turned a bruised, heavy gray. The wind picked up, and the first hard flakes of snow began to fall. Too early, too bitter for the season. Margaret sent Thomas to bring in extra firewood from the shed, and she was standing at the window, watching the snow pile on the sill, when she saw the horse. It came up the lane at a staggering walk, head low, sides heaving, and on it, slumped forward over the neck, was a figure in a dark leather cloak that she knew. "Nan!" Margaret shouted, but the old woman was already at her door, drawn by the same sight. Between them, they got Alexander off the horse and into the cottage. He was burning. She could feel the heat of him through his tunic, through his skin, like a banked fire gone wrong. His face was gray beneath the tan, and his eyes, when they fluttered open once, were glassy and unfocused. "Fever," Nan said grimly, pressing a hand to his forehead. "A bad one. He must, Hector, be coming out on the border. That wind off the northern moors will do it to a man who's been riding hard." "I'll fetch the healer," Margaret said, but Nan shook her head. "Healer's 3 villages away, and the snow's coming down like the end of the world." "You'll do, girl. You've nursed fever before." Margaret had. She had nursed her husband through a winter ague, and she had lost him anyway, not to the fever, but to a war that should never have called him away. She knew what it was to sit beside a sickbed with her hands folded and her heart in her throat, but this was different. This was the Alpha King, the man the whole North whispered about, the man whose name was spoken with fear and reverence. And he was lying in her narrow bed, his boots still on, his great shoulders taking up more room than her husband ever had. "Children," she said, her voice steady. "Thomas, take Eleanor and William into the back room. Keep them warm. Nan, help me get these boots off him." They worked in silence, Nan muttering, Margaret moving with quick, efficient hands. They got his cloak off, his boots, the heavy leather tunic. She saw the scars then, a long one across his ribs, a puckered mark on his shoulder, and the old scar on his left brow, pale against his flushed skin. She had wondered about that scar before. Now she did not wonder. She simply dampened a cloth and laid it across his forehead. He did not wake. He groaned. Once. and turned his head toward the cool cloth like a man starving for it. Nan left at dusk, pressing a bundle of dried herbs into Margaret's hands. "Brew this strong. Sponge him down when the fever peaks." And Margaret, the old woman paused at the door, her sharp eyes softening for just a moment. "You mind yourself. He's a king, but he's a man first, and men in fever think things they don't mean." Margaret nodded. She did not ask what Nan meant. She thought she knew. The night was long and terrible. The fever peaked twice. The first time, Alexander thrashed and muttered, words that came out broken and half-formed. Names, Margaret thought, or fragments of names. She could not make them out. She held his shoulders down and spoke to him in a low, steady voice, the way she had spoken to her own husband in his last illness, the way she had spoken to William when he had croup and could not breathe. "You're all right," she said. "You're safe. I've got you." She did not know why she said it. It was not true. Not really. He was the Alpha King. He did not need a village widow's comfort. But the words came anyway, and she did not take them back. The second time he went still, too still. His breathing shallowed, and his face, even in the firelight, looked like wax. Margaret's heart seized. She pressed her hand to his chest, felt the faint, uneven beat beneath her palm, and for one terrible moment she thought, then he breathed. Deep, shuddering, a breath that seemed to come from somewhere far down, and his hand moved, finding hers, closing around it. She froze. His grip was not strong, he was too weak for that. But it was there, warm and insistent, and his fingers laced through hers like a child reaching for a hand in the dark. "Don't," he said. His voice was rough, barely a whisper, and his eyes were still closed. "Don't go." Margaret's throat closed. She stood there, bent over the bed, her hand in his, and she did not pull away. She had not held a man's hand in 11 years. She had not let herself need anyone, since the day she had stood at a grave and watched them lower her husband into the frozen ground. She had built her walls high and didn't think, and she had told herself they were enough. But this man, this fierce, lonely king who did not know how to love his own nephews and niece, who had stood at her door without knocking, who had carved a whistle for a boy who did not trust him, he was holding her hand and asking her not to leave. And Margaret, for the first time in 11 years, did not want to. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She kept her hand in his, and she said, very softly, "I'm not going anywhere." His breathing eased, his grip loosened, but he did not let go. She stayed that way through the night. She brewed the herbs, she sponged his forehead, she changed the cloths, and she never once took her hand from his. She talked to him in a low voice about nothing, about everything, about the way the snow was piling on the windowsill, about how William had said "da-da" and broken her heart a little, about the pot of rosemary on the sill and how it had survived 3 winters, and how she was determined it would survive a 4th. She did not know if he heard her. She did not know if it mattered. When the first grey light of dawn crept through the shutters, Alexander opened his eyes. He was still for a long moment, his grey eyes unfocused, trying to remember where he was. Then they found her face, and something in them shifted. Something that was not fear and not confusion, but something softer, more vulnerable, like a man looking a light had not expected to find. "Margaret," he said. His voice was hoarse, but it was his own voice, not the fever's. She nodded. "You're in my house. You had a fever. You'll be all right." He looked down at their hands still clasped together on the blanket. He did not pull away. He looked back at her, and his thumb moved, once, across her knuckles. A small, unconscious gesture, like he was testing whether she was real. "I had a dream," he said slowly. "I was a boy, and I was in the dark, and no one came." His gaze held hers. Then there was a light, and a hand. Margaret's breath caught. She did not know what to say, so she said nothing. He studied her face for a long moment. The fever had left him pale and hollow-eyed. But there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Something open, unguarded, almost wondering. "No one has ever stayed," he said quietly. "Not when I needed them to." "Then you've known the wrong people," Margaret said. And then, because she did not know what else to do with the words, she added, "Your children, your nephews and niece, they're waiting to see you. Thomas said you'd come back. He said a man who carves a whistle for a child he doesn't know how to love isn't going to walk away.
Something moved in Alexander's face. He looked at their hands again, and his jaw tightened. And for a moment she thought he was going to say something important, something that would change everything. But then there was a knock at the door. Hard, urgent. 3 quick blows. Margaret's heart lurched. She pulled her hand free. She did not mean to. It was instinct, the old habit of hiding any softness. And she crossed to the door before she thought to ask who it was. She opened it. Old Widow Nan stood on the threshold, her face flushed with cold and something else, something that looked like fear. "Margaret," she said, her voice cracking. "There are men in the village, strangers. They're asking about you, about the children, about the king." Margaret stood very still. "They're saying," Nan said, lowering her voice, "that you're a scheming woman, that you've bewitched the Alpha King to get your hands on his gold and his lands. They're saying it all over the village, and the folk are starting to listen." Behind her, in the bed, Margaret heard Alexander's shift. She did not turn around. She stared at the snow on the lane, at the gray morning light, at the shape of the world she had known cracking open in front of her. "I didn't do anything," she heard herself say. "I just fed some hungry children." Nan's eyes were old and kind and full of warning. "I know, girl. But that's not what they're saying. And a lie, told often enough, starts to sound like the truth." Margaret did not answer. She stood in the doorway, the cold air washing over her, and she felt the night's fragile warmth, the warmth of a hand held in the dark, of words spoken in fever, of a king who had said "thank you" in a voice that sounded like a man, begin to slip away. The snow came again that week, thin and mean, the kind that did not settle but stung the face. Margaret walked to the well with her bucket, and her shawl pulled tight, and she felt it before she saw it. The way the women by the well fell silent, the way their eyes slid away from hers, as if she had become something they could not look at directly. She filled her bucket. She did not speak. She had learned in 11 years of widowhood that silence was often the safest answer. But silence did not protect her. It never had. By the 3rd day, the pattern was unmistakable. The baker's wife, who had bought Margaret's bride every market day for 6 years, sent her daughter instead, and the girl would not meet Margaret's eyes. The miller, who usually waved from his door, turned his back when she passed. Even the priest, who had once called her a good woman, a faithful soul, crossed the lane to avoid her. Margaret stood in the middle of the village, Sexkurtuzlo, Duar, with her basket of bread, and she understood with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather that she had become something else. She had become the woman who bewitched the Alpha King. She had become the woman who reached above her station. She had become a lie wearing her face. She went home and did not go out again that day. The children did not understand. Eleanor asked why the other girls would not play with her. William cried because the baker's wife had shooed him away from the doorstep. Thomas said nothing, but his jaw was tight, and he spent the afternoon splitting wood with a fury that had nothing to do with firewood. "They're saying things," Thomas said finally, leaning on the axe. His voice was rough, too old for his years. "About you, about him." Margaret did not ask what they were saying. She did not want to hear it from a 12-year-old boy. She wanted to hear it from no one. But the words found her anyway. They always did. It was Nan who brought them, as she always brought the news, good and bad alike, with the same sour expression and the same cup of tea in her hand. She sat at Margaret's table, warming her fingers around the cup, and she did not look away. "They're saying you've set your cap at him," Nan said bluntly, "that you're angling to be Queen of the North, that you've got him so turned around he'll give you half his lands and a crown to match." Margaret's hands stilled on the dough she was kneading. "That's not true." "I know it's not true, but that's not the point, is it?" Nan set down the cup. "The point is, there's someone in this village, or near it, who wants it to be true. Someone who's feeding the fire, Margaret. And the fire's catching." Margaret thought of the hands that had held hers in the dark. She thought of the fevered ice that had said, "Don't go." She thought of the man who had stood in her doorway and said, "Thank you," like it was a word he had never learned to say. "He hasn't come," she said quietly. 4 days, he hasn't come." Nan's silence was answer enough. "He heard the rumors," Margaret said, and it was not a question. He's a king, girl. He's heard worse about himself 100 times. But this— Nan shook her head. This is about you. And a man like that, he's not used to being watched. He's not used to having someone he cares about used against him. Margaret turned back to her dough. Her hands were steady, but her chest was not. He doesn't care about me. He cares about his children. I'm just the woman who fed them. Nan made a sound that was half a laugh, half a sigh. You keep telling yourself that, girl. But a king doesn't spend 4 days deciding whether to show his face because he just cares about the children. Margaret said nothing. She could not afford to believe it. Believing it meant hoping, and hoping meant she had something to lose, and she had learned, long ago, that losing was the only thing she could count on. The words hung between them, heavy as the winter sky. Margaret kneaded her bread and Nan drank her tea, and neither of them spoke again, until the silence was broken by the sound of small, unsteady footsteps. William toddled in from the other room, his thumb in his mouth, his eyes half closed with sleep. He went straight to Margaret, as he always did, and buried his face in her skirt. She reached down without thinking and stroked his hair. Ma, he mumbled, the words soft and blurry. Margaret felt her heart crack open. Just a little. She picked him up, settled him on her hip, and looked at Nan over his head. Does he know? She asked. Think Alexander know what they're saying about me? Nan set down her cup. He knows. Everyone knows. The question is, what is he going to do about it? Margaret did not answer. She held the child close, and she felt the warmth of his small body against her chest, and she wondered, for the first time, whether the man who had held her hand in the dark would be brave enough to hold it in the light. She found out the next morning. She was in the yard, feeding the chickens, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the frozen lane. She looked up, and there he was, Alexander, on his great black horse, wrapped in his dark cloak, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He did not dismount. He sat there, tall and silent, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. You've heard, she said finally. It was not a question. Yes. His voice was rough, like he had not slept. I've heard. And you stayed away. I stayed away to protect you. He said it like it was obvious, like it was the only answer there could be. If I come here, if I'm seen with you, it feeds the rumors. It makes it worse. Margaret stared at him. The cold wind pulled at her shawl, and she felt something in her chest begin to harden, like water turning to ice. Protect me, she repeated. You stayed away for 4 days, and you call that protecting me? I thought— He stopped. His jaw tightened. I thought if I gave it time it would die down, that they would find something else to talk about. And did it die down? He did not answer. He did not need to. Margaret could see the answer in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hand gripped the reins too tightly. They're saying I bewitched you, she said, and her voice was flat, empty. They're saying I'm trying to steal your lands up. Is this Cindy your crown? They're saying I'm a woman of low morals who's using your children to get to you. I know what they're saying. Then tell me. Her voice cracked. She stopped, took a breath, and started again. Tell me what you believe. Tell me which one of those things you think is true. Alexander looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something in his eyes that looked like pain. But then it was gone, replaced by that familiar mask of stone, and he said nothing. Say something, Margaret whispered. Please, say something. I don't know how to fix this, he said finally, and the words were so honest, so bare, that they cut her deeper than any lie could have. Margaret felt the ice close over her heart. She took a step back, toward the house, and her hand found the door frame. Then maybe you shouldn't come here anymore, she said. Maybe they're right. Maybe I shouldn't have— She stopped. She could not say it. She could not say, let myself care. Margaret, go home, Your Grace. She had never called him that before. The title felt like a door slamming shut. Go home and protect your children. I'll keep feeding them when they come, but you— She shook her head. You don't need to come with them. She turned and went inside, and she heard him say her name again, soft and desperate, but she did not stop. She closed the door behind her and stood in the dark of her little house, and she pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound. That night, Nan came again. She found Margaret sitting by the cold hearth, staring at nothing, and she did not ask what had happened. She simply sat down beside her and waited. "The mother," Nan said after a long while. "You never asked about the children's mother." Margaret looked up. "I assumed she was dead." "She is dead." Nan's voice was careful, measured. "She was Alexander's sister, his younger sister, Rosalind. She died bearing the youngest, the little one, William." Margaret felt the words land like stones in her chest. "His sister?" "His sister," Nan repeated. "Their father was a hard man, Margaret. He taught Alexander that feelings were a weakness, that a king could not afford to love. When Rosalind died, Alexander took the children, but he didn't know what to do with them. He'd never been allowed to learn how." Margaret thought of the man who had said, "Don't go in the dark." She thought of the man who had said, "Thank you," like it was a foreign language. "He's been trying," she said slowly. "He's been trying to learn." "Aye," Nan said, "and he's scared, girl. Scared of failing them, scared of failing you, scared of being seen as soft, after a lifetime of being harder than winter." Margaret closed her eyes. The ice in her chest began very slowly to thaw. But she did not go to him. She did not open the door. She sat by the cold hearth and she waited. And she did not know if she was waiting for him to come back, or for the courage to go to him herself. The snow fell all through the night. And in the morning, when she opened her door, there was nothing on her doorstep. No firewood, no flower, no sign that he had been there at all. Margaret stood in the doorway, the cold air washing over her, and she felt the crack in her heart widen just a little more. "Maybe they're right," she whispered to the empty lane. "Maybe I shouldn't have hoped for something that was never mine to have." She turned to go back inside, and stopped. On the windowsill, where the frozen rosemary had been, there was a small clay pot. The rosemary was gone. In its place was a cutting of something green and its roots wrapped in damp cloth, its leaves fresh and alive in the gray morning light. Margaret reached out and touched it, and her hands were shaking. She did not know what it was. She did not know who had left it. But she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, that she was not alone. And somewhere, beyond the frozen lane, a man who had spent his whole life learning to be hard was learning, for the first time, how to be soft. The green cutting on the windowsill became Margaret's secret morning ritual. She woke before the children, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and watered it with the cup she kept by the bed. She did not know what it was, some kind of herb perhaps, or a young vine, but it was alive, and someone had brought it to her, and that meant something she was not ready to put into words. On the third morning, she found herself talking to it. "You're a stubborn little thing," she murmured, touching a leaf. "Growing where nothing else would." The plant seemed to lean toward her hand, and she smiled in spite of herself. The children noticed the change in her before she did. Thomas said nothing, but he watched her with a new wariness, as if he could sense that something had shifted. Eleanor simply climbed into her lap during breakfast and pressed her small face into Margaret's shoulder. Baby William grabbed her apron string and held on, the way he always did, and Margaret let him. It was Nan who finally said what everyone in the village was thinking. "You've been humming," the old woman announced, appearing at Margaret's door with a basket of dried herbs. "All morning, while you swept the floor, while you kneaded the bread, you've been humming." Margaret stopped mid-motion, the broom frozen in her hand. "I have not." "You have?" Nan Sayats.
"Listen, Letley. And if you ask me, it's about time. That man's been standing at the edge of this village like a lost dog for 3 days, and you've been pretending not to see him." Margaret's cheeks flushed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Nan snorted. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The whole village knows. They're just too busy being suspicious to admit that he's been fixing the well pump and mending the fence by the East Road, without being asked, without expecting thanks." Margaret set the broom aside. She had noticed, of course. She had noticed the freshly mended fence, the pump that no longer groaned when you worked it, the pile of split firewood that appeared by her door each morning. She had noticed, and she had not known what to do with the noticing. "The market's today," Nan said, as if that were an answer. "He'll be there. You should go." "Why would I go to the market?" "To buy flour," Nan said dryly. "To see the man who's been courting you with firewood and fence posts. To do something about the fact that you've been humming." She turned to leave, then paused. "Or you can stay here and pretend you haven't been waiting for him. That's your choice." "But, Margaret," her voice softened, just a fraction, "it's been a long time since I heard you hum. Don't let pride take that away." The market at Eldwood was a modest affair. A dozen stalls clustered around the old stone cross, selling vegetables, cloth, tools, and the occasional pig. On a good day, it drew farmers from the surrounding hills. On a day like today, with winter threatening on the wind, it drew anyone with sense enough to stock up before the roads turned to mud. Margaret walked with the children, Eleanor's hand in hers, Thomas trailing behind with William on his back. She told herself
as not looking for anyone. She told herself she was here for flour and salt, and maybe a bit of honey if the price was fair. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing at the far end of the market, near the blacksmith's stall, talking to a farmer she recognized from the next village over. He wore no crown, no fine cloak, just a plain leather tunic and a woolen mantle, the same dark colors he always wore. He looked for all the world like any other traveler passing through, but he was not any other traveler, and the market knew it. People kept their distance, glancing at him sideways, whispering behind their hands. The farmer he was speaking to nodded stiffly and moved away, and Alexander stood alone in the small clearing that had formed around him. Margaret's heart did something complicated in her chest. She saw the moment he noticed her. His head turned, his gray eyes found hers across the crowd, and something in his face shifted. A softening so brief she might have imagined it. He did not move toward her. He simply stood there, waiting, as if he would not presume to approach unless she gave him leave. Thomas had seen him too. "That's the man," the boy said quietly. "The one who brought the firewood." "Yes," Margaret said. "I know. Are you going to talk to him?" She did not answer. She was already walking, pulling Eleanor gently along, her feet carrying her across the market square before her mind had decided what to say. The crowd had parted around her. She was aware of the whispers, the stares, the weight of a dozen curious eyes on her back. She kept walking until she stood before him, close enough to see the lines around his eyes, the old scar on his brow, the way his hands hung at his sides as if he did not know what to do with them. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. She stopped, took a breath. "I wanted to thank you for the firewood, and the fence, and the—" She gestured vaguely, unable to finish. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You don't have to call me that." It took her a moment to understand. "You're... She stopped. "What should I call you as?" "Alexander," he said simply. "My name is Alexander." Someone in the crowd gasped. Margaret heard it, and she knew what they were thinking, that no one addressed the Alpha King by his given name. That it was a liberty, an impertinence, a breach of every rule of rank and station. But he was looking at her with those gray eyes, and he was not asking for her deference. He was asking for something else, something she could not quite name. "Alexander," she said, testing it. The name felt strange on her tongue, too ordinary for a man who ruled half a kingdom, but it also felt right, in a way she could not explain. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Thank you," he said, "for the bread, and for—" He glanced at the children, then back at her. "For everything." I didn't know how to say it. The crowd was still watching, but Margaret found she no longer cared. The whispers would be there tomorrow, and the day after. But right now, in this moment, there was only this man, and the strange, awkward gratitude in his eyes. "Walk with me," she said, surprising herself. "There's something I want to show you." She led him to the edge of the market, away from the staring eyes, to the small lane that ran behind the church. The children followed at a distance, Thomas keeping a watchful eye, Eleanor stepping ahead, William asleep on his brother's back. When they were out of earshot of the crowd, Margaret stopped and turned to face him.
"The plant," she said. "On my windowsill. It was you, wasn't it?" He nodded, a little sheepishly. "I didn't know what else to do. The rosemary had died, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you might like something new. Something that could grow." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. "It's growing," she said. "I've been watering it. I don't know what it is, but it's growing." "It's a lemon balm," he said. "It's hardy, it survives the winter, and it—" He hesitated. "It smells like summer, even when everything else is dead." She looked at him, at this great lord of the north who had come to her village to mend fences and leave plants on windowsills, and she felt the crack in her heart begin to close. "I know about the children," she said quietly. "I know about Rosalind." He went very still. The color drained from his face, and for a moment she thought he might turn and walk away, that she had said the wrong thing, too soon, too bluntly. But he did not move. He stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "Who told you?" "Nan, the old woman next door. She said—" Margaret hesitated. "She said Rosalind was your sister, that she died when William was born, that you've been raising them alone." Alexander closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were bright with something she had not seen before, a grief so old and so deep it had become a part of him, like the scar on his brow. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said. "I didn't know if you'd want to know. I thought if you knew who I was, who they were, you might—" He stopped. "You might not want to feed them anymore. You might not want to be near me." Margaret stared at him. "You thought I would stop feeding them because of who you are?" "People do," he said simply. "People see the title, not the man. People see the king, not the person who doesn't know how to braid his daughter's hair, or how to get his son to stop crying at night, or how to hold a baby without being afraid he'll break." His voice cracked, and he looked away, ashamed of the emotion he could not contain. Margaret did not think. She reached out and took his hand. He flinched, startled, and looked down at her rough, calloused fingers wrapped around his. He had held swords and scepters, had commanded armies and signed treaties, but did not seem to know what to do with a hand held in kindness. "You're a good father," she said softly. "I've seen the way Thomas looks at you, the way Eleanor reaches for you, the way William—" She smiled. "The way William grabs your beard and won't let go." A sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. "He does that." "He does," Margaret said. "And he wouldn't do it if he didn't trust you. Children know. They always know." He looked at her, and there was something raw in his eyes, something he had spent a lifetime learning to hide. "Margaret," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be—" He gestured, helpless, at the lane, the village, the children. "This, a home, a family. I was never taught. My father believed that love was a weakness, that a man who showed affection was a man who could be broken." "Your father was wrong," Margaret said quietly. "I know," Alexander said. "I've known for a long time. I just didn't know how to be anything else." They stood there in the cold lane, his hand in hers, and Margaret felt something shift between them. A bridge, fragile and new, spanning the distance between a king and a widow, between a man who had never learned to be soft and a woman who had forgotten how to be loved. "Come to dinner," she said. He blinked. "What?" "Dinner," she said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. "Tonight, at my house. I'm making stew and there's bread and—" She smiled. "The children would like it, and so would I." He stared at her for a long moment, and she watched the war play out across his face, the hope, the fear, the disbelief. "Margaret," he said, "I don't want you to feel obligated. I don't want you to think you have to—" "I don't feel obligated," she said. "I'm asking you because I want to. Because you left a plant on my windowsill, and you mended my fence, and you stood in the middle of the market and told me to call you by your name, and because—" She took a breath.
Because I think you've been alone for a very long time, and I don't think anyone should be alone. He did not answer, but she saw something in his eyes, something that had been locked away for years, cracking open like ice in the spring thaw. "All right," he said finally, his voice rough. "I'll come to dinner." Margaret squeezed his hand, then let go. "Good," she said. "I'll make enough for an army." She turned to walk back to the children, and she had gone 3 steps when his voice stopped her. "Margaret." She turned. He was standing where she had left him, his gray eyes bright in the cold light. "Thank you," he said, "for not being afraid of me." She smiled. "I'm not afraid of you, Alexander. I never was. I was only afraid of what hoping might cost me." She walked back to the children, and she did not look back. But she could feel his gaze on her, warm and steady, and she knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason that something had begun. That evening, the stew was thick and fragrant, and the bread was warm, and the children whites, glory messy and loud and wonderful. And Alexander of House Thornwood, the Alpha King of the Northern Lands, sat at Margaret's small wooden table, holding baby William on his lap, and he smiled. It was not a king's smile, or a conqueror's smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally, after a lifetime of cold, found a place to be warm. And Margaret, watching him over the rim of her cup, felt the last of her fear melt away. That night, after the children were asleep and Alexander had gone, she stood at her window and looked at the lemon balm. It had grown, just a little, since the morning, new leaves, small and green, unfurling toward the light. She touched one, gently, and smiled. "Thank you," she whispered into the dark, "for teaching me to grow again." The messenger came at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his cloak crusted with frost. He did not stop at the village gate. He rode straight through the mavine, past the startled chickens and the wide-eyed children, and reined in before the cottage where Margaret was just setting a pot of porridge on the fire. She knew, before the man even spoke, that this was the end of something. The rider's voice was hoarse from the road. "Is the Alpha King here? I carry word from the northern keep. The old enemy has crossed the pass. He marches with 2,000 men." Margaret's hand went to her apron, folding and unfolding the worn cloth. She did not ask the rider in. She did not think to. Her heart was a cold, tight knot in her chest. Alexander came to the door before the man could dismount. He had been awake, she realized, had likely been awake for hours, standing at her small window, watching the road. His face, when he stepped into the gray morning light, was the face of a different man, not the one who had held baby Lalian and smiled. This was the Alpha King, the warlord, the man the ballads warned about. "Tell me," he said, and his voice was flat as iron. The rider told him. 2,000 men, the old enemy's banner. 3 days, perhaps 4, before they reached the valley. Alexander nodded once. He did not look at Margaret. He walked to where his horse was tethered, a great black beast that had stood patient and silent through the night, and he began to saddle it with swift, practiced hands. Margaret stood in the doorway of her own cottage, watching him, and the cold knot in her chest tightened until she could barely breathe. The children had come to the door now. Thomas stood behind her, his thin shoulders squared. Eleanor clutched her skirt, her small face pale. Baby William was still asleep inside, bundled in the blanket Margaret had sewn for him. "Alexander," Margaret said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. His hands stilled on the saddle. He did not turn around. She walked toward him, across the muddy yard, past the rider who sat his horse in awkward silence. She stopped a few paces back, close enough to see the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw was tight. "You don't have to go," she said, though she knew it was a foolish thing to say. He turned then, and his gray eyes met hers. There was something raw in them, something she had never seen before. Not fear, she did not think Alexander knew how to fear. It was something older, something like grief, worn thin and smooth as a river stone. "I do," he said quietly. "If I do not go, they will burn this valley. They will burn your cottage. They will take the children." He paused, and his voice dropped lower. "I will not let that happen. Not to you. Not to them. Margaret felt the words land in her chest like stones. Still water. She wanted to tell him that the valley could burn, that she did not care about the cottage or the fields, that all she cared about was that he come back. But the words would not come. They stuck in her throat, thick and useless, so she did the only thing she could think of. She went back inside and she packed him food, a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, the last of the dried apples. She wrapped them in a clean cloth and pressed them into his hands, and she did not let go of his fingers when he tried to take them. "Eat," she said, "even if you are not hungry. Eat." A ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close. He took the bundle and tucked it into his saddlebag. Then he looked at her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I have something to tell you," he said at last, "before I go, something I should have told you long ago." He lifted his hand and touched the scar about his left eyebrow. Margaret had noticed it before, many times, but had never asked. "It was not the kind of scar you asked about." "This," he said, "is from my father. When I was 7 years old, I cried in front of his men. A horse had thrown me, and I was frightened, and I cried. He was ashamed of me. So he took me to the cellar beneath the keep, and he made me kneel there in the dark until I stopped shaking. I was so afraid of the dark, Margaret. I still am. But I learned, that night, that a king does not show fear. A king does not weep. A king does not need anyone." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if he were reciting a lesson from a book, but Margaret heard the thing beneath it, the child, kneeling in the dark, learning that love was weakness. "I have spent my whole life trying to be that king," Alexander said. "I thought it was the only way to be strong. I thought if I let anyone close, I would fall apart." He looked at her then, and his gray eyes were tired. "And then you fed 3 ragged children from your own supper. You did not know who they were. You did not know who I was. You just saw hungry children, and you fed them." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back, hard. "I have been a king for 20 years, he said. "I have won wars. I have held this land together with my bare hands. But I have never—" He stopped, swallowed. "I have never once in my life felt as strong as I feel when I am standing in your kitchen, watching you knead bread." The wind picked up, cold and sharp, carrying the first thin flakes of snow. The rider had turned his horse and was waiting at the edge of the lane. The children were watching from the doorway, Eleanor's small face streaked with tears she was trying to hide. Margaret stepped forward and took Alexander's hand. His fingers were cold, roughened by sword and rain. She held them tight. "Come back," she said. "That is all I ask. Come back to us." He looked down at her hand in his. For a moment he said nothing. Then he reached into his collar and pulled out a thong of leather, and on it hung a single wolf's tooth, yellowed with age, wrapped in a twist of silver wire. "This was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to my father when they were married. He gave it to me on the day I became king. He told me it would remind me of what I was fighting for." He pressed it into Margaret's palm and closed her fingers around it. "I want you to hold it for me, so I have something to come back for." Margaret could not speak. She could only nod, her throat too full for words. He swung onto his horse, and for a moment he looked down at her, at the 3 children clustered behind her, then the doorway, at the thin curl of smoke rising from her chimney. His face was hard again, the warlord's mask back in place, but his eyes for just a moment were soft. "Margaret," he said. "Yes? Wait for me." It was not a command. It was the most human thing she had ever heard him say. He turned his horse and rode away, the rider falling in behind him. The hooves thudded against the frozen ground, and the snow began to fall in earnest. And Margaret stood in her yard, the wolf's tooth warm in her palm, and watched until the dark shape of him vanished into the white. That night she did not sleep. She sat by the fire with the children asleep in the next room, the wolf's tooth clutched in her hand, and she listened to the wind howl around the cottage. Eleanor came out once, rubbing her eyes, and climbed into Margaret's lap without a word. She laid her head against Margaret's shoulder and whispered, "Will he come back?" "Yes," Margaret said, and she made her voice strong. He will come back. But in her heart, the cold knot had not loosened. It had only grown heavier, and she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with love, that if Alexander did not come back, the woman she had become in these past weeks would die with him. The fire burned low, the snow fell, and Margaret sat and waited and held the wolf's tooth until the dawn came gray and silent over the valley. He had said to wait, so she would wait. She would wait as long as it took, and when he came back, when, not if, she would tell him everything. The fear she had carried since her husband died, the hate she had nursed against every man in power, the way he had undone it, all of it, without even trying. She would tell him, and she would let him hold her, and she would finally stop being afraid. The wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere in the next room, baby William stirred in his sleep and murmured, "Mama." Margaret closed her eyes and held the tooth tighter, and let the words settle into her bones. She was not his mother, not yet, but she was already his. All of them. She was already theirs. And when the dawn came and the valley lay white and silent under the snow, Margaret stood at her window and looked out at the road where he had ridden away, and she whispered the words she'd been too afraid to say out loud. "Come back to me, Alexander. I will be here. I will always be here." The news came on the 10th morning, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered white with foam. Margaret was at the well when she heard the hoofbeats, and something in her chest went cold before the man even opened his mouth. She had been reaching for the bucket, her fingers already numb from the winter air, and she watched the rider slide from his saddle and stumble toward the healer's hut, and she heard the words spill out of him like blood from a wound. "The king, he is wounded. They are bringing him here." She did not remember crossing the yard. She did not remember the bucket falling, or the water soaking into the frozen ground. She only remembered the grip of the wolf tooth in her pocket, worn smooth from 10 days of her fingers finding it again and again, and the sound of her own voice, thin and strange, asking the rider which way they were coming. By the time the cart rolled into the village, the snow had started again, soft and relentless, and Margaret stood at the gate with her apron twisted in her fists and watched them lift him down. Alexander's face was the color of candle wax. His left arm was bound in blood-stiffened linen, and there was a gash across his ribs that had soaked through his tunic in a dark, terrible bloom. His eyes were closed, his mouth was slack. The healer, old Marta, took one look and shook her head. "Get him inside. Get him warm. I've seen wounds like this go bad before the night is out." Margaret did not ask permission. She pushed past the men carrying him and led them into her own cottage, into her own bed, the one she had shared with no one since her husband died. She did not think about what it meant. She only thought about the blood, and the wax-pale face, and the way his hand hung limp at his side. She had told herself, all those 10 days, that she would not be afraid. She had told herself that she was strong now, that she had learned to trust, that she had finally stopped running from her own heart. She had been lying. The fear came back all at once, worse than before, worse than the day her husband rode away and never came home. It sat in her chest like a stone, and it did not move, not even when she tore clean linen into strips, not even when she held the bowl of hot water while old Marta worked the bloodied cloth away from his ribs. "Hold him steady," Marta said. "This part will hurt." Margaret pressed her hands against Alexander's shoulders, and he made a sound low in his throat, a sound she had never heard a man make before, a sound that was not a word, but was somehow worse than any word. She held him steady, and she whispered to him, the way she whispered to baby William when he woke from a nightmare. "I'm here," she said. "I'm here, Alexander. You're going to be all right. I'm here." She did not know if he could hear her. His eyes stayed closed, his breathing shallow and ragged, but somewhere in the middle of it, when Marta was stitching the gash across his ribs, his hand, found hers, his fingers curled around her wrist, weak but insistent, and he held on. She did not pull away. She let him hold on, and she kept whispering, and she was still whispering when the lamps burned low, and Marta finally sat back and said, "The bleeding stopped.
Now we wait. The children were sent to old widow Nan's cottage for the night. Thomas had argued, his thin face set in that stubborn grown-up way he had, but Margaret had taken his hands and said, "I need you to look after the little ones. Can you do that for me?" And Thomas had nodded, and swallowed, and gone without another word. So it was just the two of them, Margaret and Alexander, in the quiet of the cottage, with the fire crackling and the wind moaning around the shutters. She sat on a stool beside the bed, and she watched his chest rise and fall, and she counted the breaths the way she used to count the days of her husband's absence, except that counting had never helped then, and she knew it would not help now. The fever came in the second hour of the night. It came on fast, the way winter fevers did, and soon his skin was burning under her hands and his teeth were chattering even though the room was warm. She soaked cloths in cool water and laid them across his forehead, across his chest, across the places where the fever seemed to burn hottest. She talked to him the whole time, nonsense mostly, things she would never have said to him awake. "I put new herbs in the soup today," she said, wringing out another cloth. "The children ate every last drop. Eleanor asked if you were coming back. I said yes. I didn't even think about it, I just said yes, because it felt like the only true thing I knew." His hand moved on the blanket, twitching, reaching for something. She took it, and he held on, and she kept talking. "I used to be afraid of you," she said softly. "I used to believe every terrible thing they said about you. I used to think a man like you could never know what it meant to be hungry, to be cold, to lose everything and have nothing left but your own two hands." She paused, and the fire popped, and the log settled into ash. "I was wrong," she said. "I was so wrong, Alexander. You came to my door with your wounded pride and your terrible, beautiful way of caring for people, and you did not ask for anything. You just stayed. You just kept showing up. And I did not know what to do with that, because no one had ever shown up for me before, not like that, not without wanting something in return." His breathing changed. It grew deeper, steadier, and she thought for a moment that the fever was breaking. She leaned closer, and his eyes fluttered, and then they opened. They were gray, the same gray as winter storms, and for a long moment they did not seem to see her. Then they focused, slowly, and he looked at her, and his cracked lips moved. "Margaret." The sound of her name and his voice, raw and broken, undid something in her chest. She pressed the cloth to his forehead and said, "I'm here. Don't talk. Save your strength." "Margaret." He said it again, more firmly, and his hand tightened around hers. "I saw you. In the fire. I saw you standing at the gate, and I thought—" He closed his eyes, and a shudder went through him. "I thought, if I die, at least I die having seen her face one more time." She made a sound, something between a laugh and a sob, and she pressed his hand to her cheek. "You're not going to die. I won't let you. Do you hear me, Alexander? I won't let you." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she had never seen before, something raw and unguarded, like a man standing in the rain with nowhere left to hide. "I never told you," he said, "about my mother." Margaret went still. "She died when I was 6, he said, the words coming slow and thick like he was pulling them up from a deep well. "I barely remember her face. I remember her hands, and her voice, and the way she used to hum when she thought I was asleep. And then she was gone. And my father—" He swallowed. "My father said that grief was for the weak. He said a king does not weep. He said a king does not need a mother's love, because a king has a kingdom to rule." He laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "He was wrong. He was so wrong. A kingdom is not a family. A throne is not a home. I ruled 1,000 men, and I did not know how to hold a child. I did not know how to be a father to my own sister's children, because no one ever taught me how to love without armor." Margaret felt the tears on her own cheeks before she knew she was crying. She did not wipe them away. She leaned closer, and she took his face in her hands, and she said, "Look at me, Alexander." He looked at her. "Your father was wrong," she said. "Grief is not weakness. Love is not weakness. The strongest thing a person can do is let themselves be loved, and you have been fighting it your whole life because no one ever told you it was safe to lay down your sword." His eyes glistened, and he did not look away. "Tell me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Tell me about your husband." The question sat between them, heavy and gentle at once. Margaret drew a breath, and she felt the old wound pulse, the one she had carried for years, the one she had never let anyone see. His name was Edmund, she said. He was a good man, a gentle man. He could fix anything with his 2 hands, and he laughed like thunder, and he loved me in a way I did not know I deserved. She paused. He was called to fight in a border dispute, a dispute between 2 lords who could not settle their pride with words. He did not want to go. He told me he had a bad feeling about it, but the Lord demanded every able-bodied man, and Edmund was able-bodied, and so he went. Her voice cracked, and she steadied it. He died 3 weeks like a think to you, not in a great battle, not defending anything worth defending. He died in a skirmish over a strip of land no one even remembers the name of now, and I stood at his grave, and I swore I would never trust another man in power. I swore they were all the same. They send other people's husbands to die for their pride, and they call it honor. She looked at Alexander, and she saw that he was crying, silently, without a sound, the tears running down the hollows of his cheeks. I was so angry for so long, she said, and then you came, with your ragged children and your terrible, awkward kindness. And you did not ask me to trust you. You just kept showing up. You just kept being good. And I did not know how to hate a man who mended my door with his own hands, and left fresh bread on my windowsill, and looked at me like I was the only warm thing in the world. He reached up, slowly, painfully, and touched her face. His fingers were rough from sword work, calloused and scarred, and they trembled against her cheek. "Margaret," he said, "I do not know how to say this. I have never said it to anyone. I do not know if I am saying it right." "Say it anyway," she whispered. "Whatever it is, say it." He drew a breath, and the words came out raw and unguarded, stripped of all armor. "I love you," he said. "I love the way you feed people before you feed yourself. I love the way you mend things instead of throwing them away. I love the way you hold my children, my sister's children, like they are your own, because to you they are. I love the way you look at me, not like a king, not like a monster, but like a man. I have been alone my whole life, Margaret. I did not know I was alone until you made me feel like I was not." She could not speak. The words had lodged in her throat, too big to get out, and all she could do was hold his hand against her cheek and let the tears fall. "Alexander," she finally managed, her voice breaking. "I was so afraid of loving anyone again. I was so afraid of losing someone else. I thought if I did not let myself care, I could not be hurt. But you—" She laughed, a wet, trembling sound. "You broke right through. You did not even have to try. You just sat at my table and ate my soup and looked at my children like they were the most precious things in the world. And I was gone. I was gone before I even knew it." He pulled her down, gently, and she came willingly, her forehead resting against his, their breath mingling in the cold air. "I will not leave you," he said. "I know I cannot promise that. I know the world is dangerous, and I am a king, and there will always be wars. But I can promise you this, Margaret, I will always come back. I will always find my way to you. I will always, always choose you." She closed her eyes, and she let the words settle into her bones, the way she had let the wolf tooth settle there 10 days ago, and she believed him. For the first time in years, she believed. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Tonight, just stay with me." His hand found hers, and he held it, and he said, "I am not going anywhere." The fever broke before dawn. Margaret felt it happen, felt the heat leave his skin, felt his breathing ease into something deep and peaceful. She did not sleep. She stayed on the stool beside the bed, her hand in his, and she watched the light grow gray beyond the shutters. When the first pale rays touched the window, she looked at the empty pot on the sill, the one where the rosemary had frozen and died. She had not had the heart to throw the pot away. She touched the dry soil with one finger, and she made a small, quiet decision. "Alexander," she said softly to his sleeping face, "when the snow melts, we are going to plant new rosemary. Together, in front of the castle, in front of the whole world, if you want. Because I am done hiding. I am done being afraid." He did not wake, but his hand tightened around hers, just a little, and she felt the answer in it. She smiled, and she leaned down, and she pressed her lips to his forehead, and she let herself believe, truly believe, that this time she would not have to let go. The snow melted early that year, and the first green shoots pushed through the mud before anyone was quite ready for them.
Margaret stood at the kitchen window of Thornwood Castle with her hands buried in dough, watching the morning light stretch across the courtyard. A year ago, she would have called this place a fortress, a cold pile of stone that swallowed warmth. Now, she knew which windows faced the sun, which corner of the garden grew the best herbs, and which step on the back stair creaked when you tried to sneak down before dawn. She had learned the castle the way she had once learned her own cottage, by touching every surface until it felt like hers. "Margaret," Eleanor tugged at her apron, flour smudged across one cheek. "Is he coming back today?" "Who, love?" "The king." The little girl said the word the way other children said father, with a shy pride that made Margaret's chest ache. "He said he would be back before the bread was done. He said he would try, sweetheart." Margaret smiled and brushed the flour from Eleanor's cheek. "Kings are not always masters of their own time, but I promise you, he will be here for supper." She did not say that she had watched the road all morning, that she had left the window 3 times to check the gate, and 3 times told herself to be patient. A year ago, she would have been ashamed of such longing. Now she simply let it sit in her chest like a warm stone, and she let it be. The door banged open, and Thomas came in with an armful of kindling, his face red from the cold. "I split the wood by the east wall," he said, dropping the load by the hearth. "The cook said it was enough for a week, but I told her winter always comes back to bite you." He said it with such solemn authority that Margaret had to press her lips together to keep from laughing. "You sound like an old man," she said. "I am 12. He said it the way he said everything, as if it were an unarguable fact. But there was a softness around his eyes now that had not been there a year ago. A boyishness that had crept back in once he had stopped being so afraid. "Thank you, Thomas." She meant it. He nodded once, then went to the corner where his wooden whistle hung on a peg, and he took it down and turned it over in his hands. Alexander had carved that whistle for him last autumn, and Thomas had never once blown it. But he kept it polished, and he carried it everywhere, and he never let anyone else touch it. Margaret turned back to her dough. In the cradle by the fire, baby William was waking, making small, contented noises as he blinked at the ceiling. He was 3 now, and he had learned to say her name in a way that made her heart turn over every single time. "Mama," he said, reaching for her. "In a moment, sweetling." She kneaded the bread, feeling the familiar rhythms settle into her shoulders. "Let me finish this loaf, and then I will lift you up." He did not cry, he simply lay there, patient, trusting that she would come. That was the gift he had given her, she realized, the trust that she would always come back. A year ago, she had not believed anyone could rely on her like that. Now she knew she had room in her heart for it. The courtyard gate creaked, and she heard the sound of hooves on stone. "He is here," Thomas said, and he was at the window before she could move, his face pressed to the glass. "He is back." Margaret's hands stilled in the dough. She told herself not to run, that she was a grown woman with flour on her arms and a loaf not yet shaped, that there was no dignity in racing to the door like a girl half her age. Then the door opened, and Alexander filled the frame, and she forgot all of it. He looked tired. His cloak was damp with melted snow, and there was a shadow of beard on his jaw that suggested he had ridden hard through the night. But his grey eyes found her across the kitchen, and the tiredness lifted, just a little, just enough. "Margaret," he said, just her name, like a prayer he had been saving up. "Alexander." She wiped her hands on her apron, and she did not care that she was blushing. "There is bread almost ready, and the stew has been on the fire since dawn. I smell it." He smiled, and it was the smile he had learned to give her, the one that reached his eyes and softened the scar above his brow. "I rode faster than I meant to. I did not want to miss it." He crossed the kitchen, and he did not stop to greet the children or to shake the cold from his cloak. He came straight to her, and he put his hands on her shoulders, and he looked at her for a long moment, as if checking that she was real. "I told you I would be here for supper," he said quietly. "You did." She reached up and touched his jaw, feeling the stubble, the warmth of him, and I believed you. That is the difference, is it not? He did not answer with words. He pulled her to him, flour and all, and he held her against his chest, and she felt the steady beat of his heart under the cold leather of his tunic. "Mama," baby William said from the cradle, and Alexander laughed, a low, warm sound that she had learned to treasure. "He wants you," he said. "He wants yo." "Flast and think a look into you, too."
She pulled back and looked up at him. "He has been asking all morning when you would come home." Alexander's face softened. He went to the cradle and lifted the boy, holding him with a tenderness that would have surprised anyone who had known him a year ago. Baby William grabbed a fistful of his tunic and said, "King," with a happy, toothy grin. "That is right," Alexander said, his voice rough. "I am your king, and you are my boy." He crushed his forehead to the child's, and for a moment he just breathed. Margaret watched them, and she felt something settle in her chest, something that had been unsettled for so long she had forgotten what stillness felt like. A year ago, she had believed that love was something you had to earn, provision by provision, proof by proof, that it could be taken away at any moment, by war, by poverty, by the whims of powerful men. Alexander had taught her otherwise, not by words, but by showing up, day after day, until she had finally let herself believe that he would not leave. "Thomas," Alexander said, settling baby William on his hip, "did you split the wood?" "Yes, Your Grace." "How many loads?" "7, the east wall and the south corner." "Good." Alexander nodded, and there was genuine approval in his eyes. "That is the work of a man who thinks ahead. I will have the stablemaster show you how to shoe a horse tomorrow, if you like." Thomas's face lit up, though he tried to hide it. "I would like that," he said, and he went back to his whistle, turning it over in his hands with a pleasure he did not try to name. Eleanor sidled up to Margaret and leaned against her leg. "Can I help with the bread?" she asked. "Of course, love." Margaret handed her a small lump of dough. "Here, you knead this one, and I will shape the big loaf." Eli took it solemnly, as if it were the most important task in the world, and she set to work with a concentration that made Margaret's heart ache with tenderness. Alexander watched them from across the kitchen, baby William heavy in his arms, and Margaret saw something in his face that she had learned to recognize. Wonder. He was still amazed sometimes that this was his life now, that there was flour on the floor and a child at his hip and a woman by the fire who looked at him without fear. "Alazita," she said, "the rosemary." He looked at her, and she saw that he remembered. The empty pot, the frozen plant, the promise she had made to his sleeping face. "After the bread," he said. "In front of the castle, you said. In front of the whole world." "In front of the whole world," she agreed. He carried baby William to the window and looked out at the courtyard where the morning sun was melting the last of the frost. "There is a spot by the east gate," he said, "where the wall blocks the wind but the sun still reaches. I thought about it on the ride home." "You were planning it," she said, and it was not a question. "I have been planning it for a year," he said. "Ever since you told me you were done hiding." She turned back to her dough, and she let the warmth of the kitchen, the warmth of her family, settle around her like a blanket. The bread went into the oven. The stew was ladled into bowls. They'd ate at the long wooden table, the children chattering, Alexander quiet and content beside her, and Margaret thought that this was what she had been afraid to want. A table full of people who loved her. A man who looked at her like she was the whole world. A house that had become a home not because of its walls but because of the hearts inside them. After the meal, they went out to the courtyard, the 5 of them, and Alexander carried a small clay pot with a green shoot already pushing through the soil. "Here," he said, kneeling by the east gate. "This is where it belongs." Margaret knelt beside him, and she helped him dig the small hole, her hands in the cold earth, his hands brushing hers. "Together," he said quietly, "like you promised." "Together," she said. They planted the rosemary, and they covered the roots with soil, and Alexander pressed the earth down with his palm, firm and gentle all at once. "There," he said, "it will grow." "It will," Margaret agreed, and she believed it, the way she believed in the bread rising in the oven, the way she believed in the children's laughter echoing off the stone walls, the way she believed in the man beside her who had learned to love her in all the quiet ways that mattered. The afternoon faded into evening. The children ran through the courtyard, Thomas teaching Eleanor to throw a stick, baby William toddling after them with his arms outstretched. Alexander stood by the gate, watching the new rosemary catch the last of the light, and Margaret came to stand beside him. "It is a good spot," she said.
"It is the best spot in the castle," he said, "because you are here." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together as the sun sank behind the walls. "Alexander," she said after a long moment. "Yes? I am not afraid anymore." He turned his head and pressed a kiss to her hair. "Neither am I," he said. "Not of anything. Not any more, Margaret." They stood there until the light faded and the children came to pull them inside for the evening. The kitchen was warm, the fire crackled, and the rosemary sat in the evening dark, small and green, a thing full of promise. And Margaret, who had once believed she would never be loved again, who had once hidden from the world with her heart in a fist, looked around the room at the people she loved, and she let herself be happy. It was a simple thing, happiness. It was bread and stew and a man who came home. It was 3 children who called her mother, and a king who had learned to say her name like a prayer. It was rosemary, growing in the shadow of a castle wall, because she had asked for it, and he had made it so. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. It took a penniless widow to teach the ruthless Alpha King that true strength isn't found in a sword, but in the courage to love again. Would you have opened your door to those 3 strangers in the cold? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story warmed your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more.